I still remember the smell of smoke filling the room. As if it were yesterday, my mother stood before the fireplace, holding a box full of photos from my childhood. I was only 10 years old, and I didn't understand why she threw those memories one by one into the fire. Her hands were shaking, but her face was cold, as if none of them had any value. I stood there, unable to move, just watching my history disappear in flames. Each photo that turned to ash took a piece of me with it. I found myself crying softly, hoping she would notice my pain. But she said nothing, didn't look me in the eye, just continued to fan the flames as if trying to erase an entire past. My childish mind screamed for answers, but all I found was silence. In that moment, I sensed something was deeply wrong in our family. That scene never left my mind. For years I wondered, what was so terrible about those photos that she would destroy them? The fire reflected in her eyes as if it burned hotter than paper. It was as if she wanted to erase me, as if I had no right to exist in time. And that scarred me in a way I would only understand later. That day, I realized my home wasn't safe. It wasn't just about burned photos. It was about a mother who hid secrets behind the fire. A huge weight fell on my shoulders, as if I'd been condemned without knowing my crime. My childhood was stained by the smell of smoke that never left my memories. And before I continue this story, I need to ask something of you who are listening to me now. Share this story to reach more people, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment about where you're listening from. I'll be thrilled to read each comment. It was at this point in my life that silence turned into questions that echoed for years. And just when I thought I'd never have answers, my uncle appeared with a truth that could change everything. This is where the real chapter of this story begins, and you need to be prepared, because nothing is as it seems. After that night, the ashes became a ghost in my life. I grew up without family albums, without birthday records, without the photos other children proudly displayed. I always made excuses when asked to bring childhood photos to school. I'd say we'd lost them in a flood, or that they were stored in an inaccessible place. But inside, shame consumed me. My mother never brought it up again. Whenever I tried to ask, her eyes would harden and her mouth would set in a thin line. It was like talking to a wall. I learned early on that there were things forbidden in the house, and this was the biggest secret of all. With each silence from her, the hole inside me grew deeper. I would spend sleepless nights wondering what was in the photos. Was it about me, about her, or about someone who shouldn't exist? This question became my most constant nightmare, because I didn't just miss the images. I felt like a part of my story was missing, as if entire pages had been ripped from a book. And believe me, carrying this emptiness shapes us. I grew up trying to prove who I was, as if I needed to deserve to exist. Other children had visible memories. I only had smoke and silence. Every time I saw an old photograph of another family, I felt like a knife was cutting me inside. The cruelest thing was realizing that no one else seemed to care. My mother continued to live as if nothing had happened. And my father, well, he never wanted to talk about it either. It was as if the two of them were bound by a dark pact, and I was stuck in the middle, unsure of where I came from or where I was going. It was in this abyss that I grew up, until, 20 years later, my uncle called me for a conversation that would change everything. His voice trembled as he said the time had come to tell me the truth, and in that moment, I felt the weight of 2 decades about to reveal itself, and nothing could have prepared me for it. It was a typical Sunday when my phone rang. On the other end, I heard my uncle's voice, someone who rarely approached our family. There was something strange in his tone, a mix of urgency and hesitation. He asked to meet me at a cafe far from the city, away from any prying eyes. My breath quickened, as I felt I would finally have some answers. As I drove to the place, every mile seemed to carry the weight of years of silence. The memories of that night by the fire replayed like a movie in my head. I wondered if I was ready to hear what he had to say. And at the same time, a part of me feared the truth would be even more painful than the questions. When I arrived, I saw my uncle sitting alone, staring into the cup of coffee in front of him. He looked older than I remembered, as if he'd been carrying a burden hidden for decades. His eyes lifted slowly when he saw me, and in that look was a mixture of guilt and compassion. It was as if he already knew how much this would shake me. I sat in silence, waiting for him to begin. The noise of the people around me seemed distant, as if the world had disappeared, leaving just the two of us. My uncle took a deep breath and said, "It's time for you to know the truth about your mother and about those photos." My heart raced, and suddenly, Everything around me lost its meaning. That moment felt like a portal opening before me. I had waited 2 decades to hear those words. And at the same time, I wanted to run away, to return to the ignorance that, even though painful, still protected me. But there was no going back. That cafe became the stage where my life would change forever. In a firm voice, my uncle promised to tell everything, but he made it clear, after I tell you, you will never see your mother the same way again. And that was how the wound began to open, slowly, revealing secrets that had been buried beneath the ashes of the past. My uncle began by describing the night before the photos were destroyed. He said my mother had received a phone call that left her in shock. She spent hours locked in her room, crying and pacing. When she finally emerged, it seemed she had made an irreversible decision. And that very night, the photos began to be burned. As he spoke, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Never in all my childhood had I seen my mother cry like that. It was as if the fire had been a ritual to bury something much greater. My uncle took a deep breath before continuing, as if each word weighed a ton. He then revealed that the photos weren't just of me. There was someone in them I didn't know, a figure always by my side, smiling, present at important moments. That someone, he said, could no longer exist in your life, according to your mother's decision. My stomach churned, because I had never heard anything like it. The idea that someone important had been erased from my memories left me in shock. It was as if my childhood had been edited, cut, and manipulated. And suddenly, I realized that perhaps my mother hadn't just wanted to destroy memories, but a truth that belonged to me. My heart pounded, as if it were going to explode. My uncle paused, looking me in the eyes. There were unshed tears there, but also a need to free myself from that emptiness. He said, "The reason your mother burned everything wasn't about you. It was about the person who was always beside you in the photos, and the secret she wanted to hide." In that instant, I realized the fire hadn't just taken images. It had taken an entire piece of my identity, and I needed to know who this mysterious person was, because somehow, I sensed it would forever change the way I saw my mother, and even myself. My uncle lowered his voice, as if afraid someone might overhear us. He said the mysterious person in the photos had a name that could never be spoken in our house. That name was forbidden by my mother, as if it were a curse. He paused, took a deep breath, and finally said, "It was your brother." In that instant, the ground seemed to drop away from under my feet. Brother? What do you mean? I'd never heard there was another child in the family. The revelation hit me like a storm, and I felt my body tremble. My hands were sweating, and for a moment I thought I couldn't listen any longer. My uncle explained that I had an older brother, someone who was there for me every step of my early childhood. He appeared in photos holding my hand, playing with me, smiling as if he were my protector. But suddenly, he disappeared without a trace, and my mother swore no one would ever speak of him again. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as if half my life had been stolen, extinguished with fire and silence. Every unexplained birthday, every emptiness I felt without understanding, it all began to make sense. But the question that tore at me was, why? What had happened to my brother? My uncle held my hand across the table and said, "Your mother believed she was protecting you, but at the same time, she destroyed something you were entitled to know." His words echoed within me, a mixture of anger and pain. I needed the full truth. Crumbs were no longer enough, and it was at that point that I realized my life would never be the same. If I had a brother, I needed to find out where he was, or why he was no longer part of our family. This was the missing piece of the puzzle, and my heart knew the answer would be devastating. My uncle continued, his every word like a knife opening old wounds. He explained that my brother had been removed from the family by a drastic decision, a dark event, a mixture of pain, secrecy, and shame. My mother believed that erasing any trace of him would be the only way to move on. He described how different my brother was, intense, full of energy. He said he had a strong personality, but also a deep sensitivity. He was loved by everyone, but he carried a pain no one could explain. And at some point, that pain transformed into something bigger, something that changed our lives forever. My heart raced as I tried to take in every detail. I needed quick answers, but my uncle spoke carefully, like someone holding a piece of glass about to shatter. He said he didn't want to hurt me, but that I deserved to finally know the truth. With every second, the tension grew, and the silence between one sentence and the next felt like shouting. I asked directly, "What happened to him?" My voice was shaky, almost a whisper, but filled with desperation. My uncle lowered his eyes, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. The weight was unbearable, as if time had stopped to torture me. It was then that he said, "Your brother is no longer with us." The words fell like stones on my chest. I felt the world spin, and my legs almost gave out. It was as if I'd lost someone I'd only just discovered existed. An absurd pain washed over me, as if something I'd never been able to hold on to had been ripped away. But the revelation wasn't complete yet. My uncle said there was more, much more to the tragedy, and that my mother believed it was best to keep me away from the truth. The fire, the ashes, the silence. It was all part of a desperate plan of protection. But now, I needed to know how far this lie had gone. My uncle closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving the scene in his memory. He began to tell me about the night it all happened. He said my brother had disappeared from home, leaving everyone in despair. It was winter, snow covered the streets, and my parents searched for him for hours, without success. Fear hung in the air like a dense shadow. In the middle of the night, the police knocked on the door. They had found a body near the town lake. My uncle said the shock was so devastating that no one knew how to react. My mother fell to her knees, screaming, while my father stood paralyzed, unable to say a word. The entire house was filled with silent mourning. I was just a baby back then, unable to comprehend anything. But my uncle said my presence was the only thing that kept my mother going. At the same time, every time she looked at me, she saw in it the reflection of her lost son. It was as if I were a living reminder of what she wanted to forget. It was then that she made the decision to erase all trace of him. She didn't want any photos, objects, or memories that could bring back that pain. It was easier for her to believe he'd never existed. The fire in that fireplace was her way of turning the suffering into ashes. As my uncle spoke, I felt short of breath. My heart sank, and I fought not to break down right there in the cafe. It was too cruel to discover that my entire life had been built on secrets, and even crueler to realize that somehow I had been the reason she forced herself to forget. My uncle held my hands and said, "You have to understand. She did this to survive the pain, but without realizing it, she also destroyed a part of you." Those words echoed like hammers inside me, and for the first time, I realized that my mother wasn't just tough, she was broken inside. After the tragedy, my uncle said there was a family meeting. Everyone was shaken, but my mother was the one who took the lead. She demanded that no one ever mention my brother's name in my presence. She said I deserved to grow up free from that pain, without carrying the weight of the past. It was a pact forced out of desperation. My father, though silent, agreed. He withdrew into himself, becoming distant and cold. He was never able to deal with the loss, much less with the way my mother chose to deal with it. Grief became a prison, and each served their sentence in silence. My uncle, however, disagreed. He believed that one day I should know the truth, because living without answers would be an even greater wound. But he was silenced, intimidated by my mother, who was willing to do anything to keep the secret buried. Her fear of losing me was also a fear of reliving the tragedy. Little by little, everyone in the family began to adapt to the silence. It was easier to pretend my brother had never existed, easier to move on from a mutilated past. But every time they looked at me, his shadow loomed large, like a ghost no one dared mention. My uncle confessed that the weight of this pact had eaten away at his soul for 2 decades. He saw the unanswered questions in me, saw my silent pain, and knew it was wrong to keep hiding it. So, in that cafe, he broke the pact, even though he knew it could cause an irreparable rift between him and my mother. I listened to him with tears in my eyes. The truth hurt, but it was also liberating. Because, for the first time, I had a name for the emptiness I carried. I had a story for the silence that had accompanied me since childhood, and I knew I had to confront my mother, no matter what. I left that cafe with shaky legs, as if the ground had turned to quicksand. My uncle's words echoed in my head, suffocating me with every step. I knew I couldn't keep it to myself. The truth needed to be spoken out loud, even if it meant opening a wound that never healed. I spent the night awake, pacing my room. My mother's face came to mind, always cold and distant, and now charged with new meaning. I needed to face her, not just for myself, but also for the brother I never had the chance to know. Silence was no longer an option. The next day I went to her house. My heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the doorknob. When she opened the door, her eyes studied me, and within seconds, she realized something was different. "What's wrong?" she asked, but her voice wasn't as steady as usual. I sat down at the table and got straight to the point. "I know about him. I know I had a brother." The impact was immediate. Her face drained of color, and for a moment I thought she might faint. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy, as if the air had turned to lead. She tried to deny it, mumbling incoherent words, but it was too late. I looked at her and said, "You burned my memories, but you can't burn the truth." At that moment, tears began to stream from her eyes, breaking down a wall she had built for 20 years. It was the first time in decades I'd seen my mother cry in front of me, and in that cry, there was something that mixed pain, guilt, and love. I knew the confrontation had opened a door she never wanted to unlock, but there was no going back. I needed to hear her side of the story. My mother slumped in her chair, covering her face with her hands. Tears streamed uncontrollably, and her breath was ragged with sobs. I had never seen that woman, always so rigid, fall apart like that, and it broke me inside, even though I was overcome with anger. She lifted her head, her eyes red and teary, and said, "I just wanted to protect you. You don't understand. I couldn't bear to lose you too." Those words hit me hard. It was as if all the silence, all the ash, all the weight of the last 2 decades had been shaped by fear. My mother told me that after my brother's death, every day was torment. She couldn't look at me without remembering him, without feeling the open wound of his absence. So, in a desperate act, she decided the only way to move on was to erase every trace of him. The fireplace became her confessional, and the fire, her attempt at healing. I listened to it all with a broken heart. Part of me understood her despair, but another part screamed with rage. I had grown up without answers, carrying an emptiness that should never have existed. Her choice had robbed me of the truth, denied me the chance to know who I truly was. She then held my hands and begged, "Forgive me. I thought I was doing what was best for you." Her voice trembled, and I realized that this seemingly indestructible woman was actually made of scars. The strength I knew was just a disguise for a broken heart, and it was at that moment that I understood. The lie that had suffocated me for so many years was born of her fear of losing me, but in trying to protect me, she had lost a part of me in another way. My mother's breakdown revealed the stark truth. No one emerges from a tragedy whole. When my mother finished speaking, a heavy silence fell over the room. I looked around and realized there was nothing of my brother there. No toys, no clothes, no portrait. It was as if he had never existed, and this erasure hurt more than the tragedy itself. I felt a rage building inside me, not just because she had destroyed the photos, but because she had robbed me of the chance to make memories. She had robbed me of stories, of laughter, of details that could have given me a connection with him. All of it had turned to dust in the fireplace. My heart pounded, and the questions came like waves. What was his favorite color? What did he sound like? Had he taught me to ride a bike? How to defend myself from bullies at school? I would never have answers, and it crushed me inside. My mother wept silently, and I realized she carried those same questions. Only instead of facing them, she chose to forget. The problem is that forgetting also kills. It kills slowly, silently. And now I understood that I wasn't the only one carrying scars. I looked at her and said, "You didn't just burn photos. You burned pieces of who I am." My voice was firm, filled with pain. She didn't respond, just stared at me with eyes that begged for forgiveness. But at that moment, I didn't know if I could offer it to her. It was at that moment that I realized my life had been split in two, before and after the truth. And I had no idea how to rebuild my identity from the ashes of a stolen childhood. For the next few days, I couldn't look in the mirror without seeing a shadow behind me. It was as if the reflection were incomplete, as if my brother were still there, somehow, waiting to be recognized. His absence had become a constant presence. I spent hours imagining his face, trying to recreate it from my uncle's few descriptions. I closed my eyes and saw him walking beside me, protecting me, teaching me things I never learned. He was a ghost of flesh and blood inside my mind, a presence so real it hurt. Every detail of my past took on new meaning. The silence at parties, the heavy glances between my parents, the inexplicable coldness. Everything was a consequence of that buried secret. My entire life had been a broken mirror, reflecting only fragments of the truth. I began to feel anger not only toward my mother, but also toward my father. He had chosen cowardly silence, preferring to hide behind pain rather than tell me the truth. Everyone had been part of this charade. and I was the only victim who never had a choice. But deep down, there was something that burned brighter than anger, the need to honor my brother. I couldn't let him be just a forbidden name, a face burned into photos. He deserved to exist in my story, even if they tried to erase him. It was at that point that I made a decision. I would rebuild his memory, with or without my mother's help, because if my childhood had been stolen, I wouldn't let his existence be too. After days of conflict, I gathered my courage and went back to look for my uncle. I needed everything he remembered about my brother, every detail, every memory, every story. I couldn't accept his life being reduced to ashes. When I arrived, he already seemed to be waiting for me, as if he knew I would return. We sat together, and he opened a dusty box he'd kept hidden for years. Inside, I found small objects that had escaped the fire: a metal toy car, a faded children's t-shirt, and even a colorful drawing of two children holding hands. In the corner, it read, "Me and my brother." As I touched those objects, I felt an energy course through me. It was as if he were there, showing me that his presence had never truly been erased. My uncle began to tell me stories of how loudly he laughed, how he always looked after me, how he had a special way of lighting up any room. Each word brought tears to my eyes, but also warmth to my chest. I was finally getting to know my brother, albeit in a fragmented way, and I realized my mother hadn't been able to fully fulfill her plan. His memory was still alive, hidden in the memories of those who dared disobey the pact. It was at that moment that I decided I would speak about him out loud. It didn't matter if my mother wanted me to or not. My brother deserved to exist, deserved to be remembered. The silence would be broken, and I wouldn't let his story be buried again. It was a point of no return. And I knew that by choosing this path, I would face my mother's wrath, but I would also gain the freedom that had always been denied me. I arrived at my mother's house a few days later, holding my uncle's box. When she opened the door and saw the objects, her face turned to pure panic. "Where did you get these?" she asked, her voice almost broken. I looked at her and said firmly, "He won't be forgotten. Not in my lifetime." She tried to snatch the box from my hands, but I held on tightly. It was as if we were fighting not just for memories, but for my brother's soul. Her desperation was so intense that for a moment, I thought she would break right there. But I wouldn't give in. Not this time. Tears streamed down her face as she screamed, "You don't understand. I don't want you to suffer what I suffered." I screamed back, "But I already suffered. I suffered my whole life without knowing who I was." Silence fell after those words, and in that instant I realized she was falling apart too. She fell to her knees, hugged the box to her chest, and cried like never before. It was a cry that came not just from the present, but from 20 years of accumulated pain. I knelt beside her and for the first time, cried with her. Two survivors of a tragedy, finally facing the ghost that haunted us. Through her tears, she finally said his name aloud, a name that had never been spoken before me, and hearing it was like feeling my brother reborn within me. It was as if, finally, he had regained his rightful place in our story. That was the climax of truth. There were no more secrets, no more ashes, just two broken people trying to rebuild what was left. And for the first time, I realized that my mother wasn't just the villain of my story. She was also a victim of the same silence that had wounded me. After that day, nothing was the same again. My mother and I began, little by little, to rebuild what had been destroyed. There was still pain, there was still hurt, but now, there was also the truth. And the truth, even though painful, brought a freedom I had never felt before. I began to speak of my brother without fear, remembering him in every detail I could recall. My uncle continued to tell me stories, and each word was like a piece of the puzzle being completed. My brother was no longer a ghost hidden in the ashes. He was a part of me, and I refused to let him be forgotten. My mother, even through her tears, began to open up. For the first time, I heard her pain unmasked, heard her heart shattered into pieces. I realized she hadn't just burned photos. She'd burned herself, trying to erase an ineradicable pain. And in that recognition, a new connection was born between us. I understood that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about accepting that, even with mistakes, we can still move forward. My mother will never be free from the scars of tragedy, but by telling me the truth, she gave me back the chance to explore my own roots, and that was the first step toward healing together. Today, when I think about the fire that consumed my childhood photos, I don't just feel anger. I also feel the strength of having survived a story they tried to erase. It hurt, it destroyed, but it also transformed me. And in the end, from the ashes, the truth that was always waiting for me was reborn. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. Subscribe to the channel, share this story on WhatsApp, and leave a comment about where you're listening from. It'll be amazing to read each comment and feel like this story has found a place in your heart.